Good afternoon. My name's Tom Jones, and I'm the Executive Director of the Faith Inclusion Network. I want to welcome you to this webinar that we have today with Darla Schumm. I know so many people are looking forward to visiting with her and hearing about her new book. So we're glad that you're with us. For those of you that don't know about the Faith Inclusion Network, we help faith communities include people with disabilities through trainings and connections with resources and materials. We can assist a faith community as they attempt to include people with disabilities and their families. So, if you would like some assistance with that, please reach out, put your name in the chat, and we'd be happy to work with you. Now, what you're all here for is quite a treat because Darla Schumm is just fascinating lady that I've worked with before. She was on the panel for the Institute on Theology and Disability 3 years ago, and it was an interfaith panel. And so I'm really happy to reconnect with Darla today. Darla is the author of Healing Ableism, Stories About Disability and Religious Life, which is found at Rutgers. The book can be found at Rutgers University Press. Darla received her BA in Interdisciplinary Studies with concentrations in history, psychology, and women's studies from Goshen College. Her MA in social ethics from Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California, and her PhD in religion, ethics, and society from Vanderbilt University. In addition to her 20 years as a religious studies professor at Hollins University, Darla is the Hollins Associate Provost for Curriculum and Faculty Engagement. Darla's research focuses on the intersections between religious studies and disability studies. In addition to her recent books, she is the co-editor of several books, including Disability in World Religions, An Introduction, a textbook on world religions and disability. She has several published articles in this area, and she enjoys traveling, knitting, reading fiction, and spending time with her friends and family. On another note, Darla happens to be blind. And so, as she wrote the book, Healing Ableism, she writes from her lived experience and gives an authentic account of some of her experiences. So, I'm very excited to give to you Darla Schumm.
Thanks, Tom. I am so excited to be here with all of you today. I know there are some old friends on the call, and I'm thrilled to make some new friends today. I want to thank Rebecca and Tom in particular for organizing these great events, and I'm honored to be leading one of them. And I know that FIN or Faith Inclusion Network is doing really, really great work. And a testament to that is all of the little chimes I keep hearing, which are indications that people keep popping in. So welcome, everyone. What we're going to do today with our time is a couple of things. We're going to start in a moment with a quick interactive exercise. So we want to wake up your brains and get you thinking about some of the issues we're going to be discussing. And then Rebecca and I are going to have a conversation. Rebecca has prepared some really wonderful and thoughtful questions, and she and I are going to have a chat about the book and other topics. And then we're going to leave some time for general Q&A for questions from all of you. So please, as you're listening, as questions come up, feel free to jot them down, pop them in the chat. But at the end, we'll save some time for you all to ask questions. So, Tom, if you could put the slide up, we're going to start today with a very brief scenario and then have you do a little reflecting on it. And Tom is going to share his screen, and then I've also asked him to read aloud what's on the screen so all of us can know.
The screen's entitled Healing Ableism. It's Shabbat morning at a synagogue. Services include Hebrew prayers projected on a screen, a fast-paced service with standing and sitting, Kiddush with crowded buffet tables, a sermon with no captions.
So I do want to say this could be any religious service. We're not picking on Judaism here. That just so happens to be the example, but it could be from any faith tradition. So we're going to try and be really fancy today, and we have a poll um, with a question that allows you all to input a short answer response, and Tom is gonna send that out. And if you can, thinking about the scenario, the Shabbat service, respond to the question in the poll and submit your answer. Tom will just read a couple of the answers that come back in.
Okay, so we should, hopefully everybody can see the poll.
I can't see it.
You can't?
Nope.
No?
No? Okay. Well, we can do this a different way. The question is simply who might have trouble participating in this service? And if you want to pop answers in the chat function of Zoom, that's great. If you want to unmute yourself and just shout out some answers, if that's easier, that's fine too. So again, the question is who might have trouble participating in this service?
Hi, this is Maria, and I would say any person who has any physical disability having to do with movement, sight, hearing, uh, maybe someone who has anxiety, um, um, yeah, basically, you'd have to be what the world calls perfect
Mm-hmm.
to not have a problem here.
Yeah. Thanks, Maria. Anybody else?
Hi, my name is Marianne. And a person who couldn't be included would be myself. I cannot sit and stand. I
Mhm.
cannot put my head back, so I couldn't read anything up on a screen. I
Mhm.
couldn't move around in a crowded buffet table room. And I might be able to hear the sermon. It depends on where it's coming from. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Marianne.
I would add to all that people with neurodivergence, just autism, things like that, sensory sensitivities with the crowd.
Mhm. Yeah.
Those who don't read Hebrew
Those who don't read Hebrew,
and
perhaps, yeah,
Jews.
depending
Yeah.
on
Although you can project transliteration just as much
it
as you can.
can, yeah, yeah. And
And
some
not
Reformed services
they do, yeah.
are primarily in English, but yeah, that could be a
And
potential.
first-time visitors and non-Jews may be
Mhm.
confused with what's going on.
Mhm. And again, that's
And
true in any faith tradition, right? If it's not your own, you might be very lost in a service. Yeah.
and you also might note that those with some mental health issues might have issues ranging from feeling like you can't really join the community to people who have eating disorders, and thus the
Mhm.
whole kiddish can be problematic.
Mhm. Yeah. Is anything coming through in the chat, Tom?
Yes, a few things. People with physical disabilities who can't stand or easily, people who can't hear, um, people who can't read, have those difficulties, and people who may need a little bit more time to process, since it is fast paced.
Mhm.
Um, and people with low vision or problems with sight. Uh,
Yeah.
Megan mentioned folks with challenges with fine motor skills, specifically thinking of kiddish tables.
Yeah. Well, great. You all, as I would expect to people who are interested in a webinar like this, you all have beautifully illustrated what some of the barriers are for people with disabilities, in the context of religious worship and religious services. And as a result of those barriers, who may not only feel excluded, but be excluded from full participation in the life of the community. Because as many of us, all of us know, central to the life of a religious community is the practice of worship or the rituals that we participate in together. That's a central component of what makes a religious community a community. So, this we open with this exercise partly because it is exactly these kinds of questions and the barriers that people with disabilities experience that led me to want to write my book. And what I discovered, and I think most of us probably know, is that 99.9% of the time, maybe 100% of the time, religious communities are not intentionally exclusionary or unwelcoming, but they don't realize they maybe even have made some attempt, some effort at being inclusive, but it is our preconceived excuse me, assumptions about how bodies should and can operate that often cause um, folks with disabilities to have difficulty participating in services like the one we described. So that was part of my motivation for writing the book. And I will turn it over to you, Rebecca, to get to some of your excellent questions. And we'll spend probably 20-25 minutes, um, maybe closer to 20 minutes chatting, and then we'll open it up to the rest of you for questions you may have. So, Rebecca.
Well, thanks for leading us in that exercise. I think that's a great way to get started and get people's input and ideas. So we'll kind of start with a general definition, I think that would be helpful because I think most people in our webinar, in our audience, know about ableism and disability pretty well, but I think it's good to still start with how do you define ableism and disability for what we're talking about today?
Yeah, thanks. So, ableism is one of those words, at least in my experience in a university community right now, that I hear tossed around a lot. But when I actually start having conversations with people, they often have a hard time pinning down an exact definition. My husband and I even debated whether it was an appropriate word for the title of a book that was written for a more general audience. And I won that argument because it was my book. And so I got to pick the title. But as I write in the book, I believe that ableism is a combination of multiple things. So, at its most basic level, ableism is discrimination against people with disabilities. And that's how most people that I talk to would define ableism. It's a form of discrimination against people with disabilities. But I think that another important component of the definition of ableism is that it is also the attitudes and stereotypes and assumptions that many of us, disabled and able-bodied alike, make about what a quote unquote normal body is or can do. So it is both the literal discriminatory actions, but it's also how we think about embodiment, and most importantly, how we think about what we mean by, again, with scare quotes, normal embodiment. And a lot of times that part of the definition is missing from how people think about ableism. But there's yet a third component that I think is critical for communities of any kind. For our purposes today, we're thinking most specifically about religious communities. And that third component of ableism is how power and privilege interact in systems and structures and institutions to disadvantage people with disabilities and to give advantage to folks who are typically described as non-disabled. So when we're thinking about ableism and when we're defining ableism, I think it's really important for us to consider all three of these components of the definition and to consider how they overlap, interact, intersect with one another. So the literal acts of discrimination combined with attitudes and stereotypes about normal embodiment, and how power and privilege produce and reinforce these systems and structures that we all participate in, that we all live in, that routinize the subordination of some bodies and elevate the production of other bodies. So that's my starting point for how I think about and define ableism.
And for disability, could you just give a brief sentence? I know it's too large.
Disability, defining disability. Yeah, well, I think this is a very vexing question. And I mean, I think a couple of folks have already mentioned on the call have already mentioned that they too live with disability, as do I. And as we all know, it's so hard to define, to come up with just a succinct definition of disability because it cuts across all vectors of age, class, race, gender, and disability is the largest minority group worldwide, certainly also in the US. And so, obviously, disability includes people with physical impairment, cognitive, developmental, mental health challenges. Um, it goes on and on, right? Their learning disabilities. Um, in the book, I am very clear that I am focusing on physical disabilities. I conducted interviews. So the book is a blend of my own story, other disabled people's stories in conversation with some theories and concepts from disability stories. And I write about people with disabilities and their experiences in religious communities and organizations. So the book is really primarily focused on people with physical disabilities, excuse me. Part of that is because it grows out of my own experience with a physical disability. Part of it is because I had to limit the scope of it in some way. But I do believe that a lot of what I write about in the book applies across the board to folks with other types of disabilities, cognitive, mental, chronic fatigue issues. So I, I try really hard, and I did this when when I interviewed people. I really believe that each of us who lives with disability should be able to define what that means for ourselves. And we have some general understanding, of course, of what disability is, but it's such a contentious term in terms of nailing down a definitive definition that I really, if someone self-identified as having a disability, I was happy to interview them for the book, and I didn't have a real strict parameter for what that meant because I didn't want to determine or say, yes, you are disabled or disabled enough, and no, you're not. If an individual identified as a person with a disability, that that was enough for me. So I know that's not a super satisfactory answer, Rebecca, but it's what I've got.
No, it's helpful to understand who you included and what types of backgrounds they have. So it's a range and
Yeah.
also a range of religious backgrounds
Yeah.
too. And I'm glad that you shared about how there's like examples, and I think that's one of the most engaging parts of the book is how you incorporated different stories, including your own,
Yeah.
which I hope we can get to some of those because
Yeah.
they're quite interesting, I think, to look at. So I wanted to ask you about the religious communities, how do you see that ableism shows up most typically in the faith communities? And as you said just before, it's not always something that is overt or people are intentionally doing. They're
Mhm.
not even aware that they're doing it sometimes. So, how do you address that in the
Mhm.
religious settings if they're not even aware that they're doing it?
Yeah. So, this question we could probably talk about for an hour, and I would guess that many people on the call would have great answers to this question as well. Um, uh, Ableism shows up in so many ways in religious communities. I'll talk about a couple of examples, and we've already been talking about some examples through our opening exercise. I think sometimes the most obvious place where ableism shows up in religious communities is, in fact, in the way that we conduct our worship practices, our rituals. So, a lot of the things that we were talking about a moment ago, just many services have you stand up, sit down, kneel, stand up again, walk to the front. You know, if you're in a Christian context and the Eucharist or communion is celebrated, you have to walk to the altar. I start one of the chapters in the book talking about what I refer to as my communion dilemma. My husband is an Episcopal priest, and so I attend an Episcopal church when I attend church. Um, and just getting from the pew to the communion rail is a bit of a conundrum for me. Um, and and a lot of times just those simple rituals that are so embedded into the lives of our religious communities, we don't even think about how that might impact someone with a disability. So the very practical, how do we move literally? How do we expect bodies to move through our rituals, through our religious spaces, is one way that ableism often shows up. It shows up in many of our sacred texts. I I won't spend a lot of time today on this, but I spend a fair amount of time in the book talking about Christian scriptures and particularly the healing narratives of Jesus in the Christian scriptures, and how if you read those healing stories, you will notice that nowhere in the Christian canon does Jesus encounter a person with a disability and not heal them. So that I realize is complicated and can be a little bit controversial because many people find that comforting and hopeful and empowering. But the flip side of that is people with disabilities in the healing stories are never welcomed into the Christian community until they are healed. So what does that say to those of us who don't experience physical healing? Um, So that's one way that ableism shows up in some of our sacred texts. Now, I also want to be really clear. In the Christian Bible, there are other examples of leaders, religious leaders with disabilities. So I'm not saying that there aren't people in the text with disabilities, but it is something to think about in terms of how those healing narratives are constructed in the canon. Other ways that ableism can show up in religious communities is just in the ways that people might express or show discomfort and awkwardness with bodies that aren't functioning in the way that, again, we think, quote unquote, they should. Um, I've been in religious services with folks with developmental disabilities, for example, who are very excited and enthusiastic about worship. And again, if you recall, I often attend an Episcopal church, which is usually very prescribed and staid, and everybody does the same thing at the same time. And I know there are many other traditions that are much more lively and congregational participation. But when a person maybe um, acts in a different way than what we expect them to in the context of worship, there can be some very awkward, uncomfortable moments. That's a way that ableism shows up. So those are just a few examples. I'm guessing that you all have others that you are thinking about, and that you could share as well. But it shows up in attitudes, it shows up in practices, it shows up in rituals, it shows up in sacred texts. And again, not because religious communities want to be hurtful, exclusionary, discriminatory, usually because they haven't stopped to consider some of the questions that we're talking about today.
That's quite a range of issues that I feel like we could talk about all of these even
Yeah.
separately. And some people are starting to put in the chat some of their comments about
Great.
about this, which we can get to soon. I do want to come back to what you were saying about the healing narratives, because I feel that's maybe specific to Christianity, but because healing is in your title, I want to come back to that question. But since we're on the topic of ableism in the communities and we're talking about that, what are some of the practical ways that we could address some of what you just talked about, like the attitudes and the practices? And people are commenting on that in the chat, but what are your thoughts about the most easy and practical ways to address the ableism, whether it's language, training, physical things?
Yeah. So I don't know if I would say there are easy ways, but I think there are certainly ways and important things that religious communities can do. I would say probably the most important, and it may sound a little simplistic, but I really do believe this is where religious and other communities really need to start, which is we need to start with a willingness to engage in the conversation with open hearts and open minds. So, and this again, it may sound easy and simple, but I think it is probably the hardest and the most necessary first thing that needs to happen, which is religious communities have to be willing to say, we want to have a conversation about the ableism that may be present in our communities. We are committed to being inclusive, diverse, welcoming communities where every body belongs. And to do that, we have to be honest about where we might be failing to live up to those commitments. So I think that that is really the first step. In the book, my proposal at the end of the book for how communities can do some of the work of healing ableism, I call it accessible love, which was another title possibility for the book. So I talk about the concept of accessible love as a starting point for religious communities to start doing the hard work of healing ableism in their own communities. And accessible love, like disability, is hard to define in large part because I believe that accessible love is context specific, meaning that it's going to look a little bit different in each community, but at its core, it is the accessible love is the commitment to confront those components of the definition of ableism that I was talking about a couple of minutes ago. So accessible love is the commitment to confront discriminatory acts against people with disabilities, whether they be intentional or unintentional. It is the willingness to scrutinize our attitudes and stereotypes about embodiment. It is the willingness to take a really hard look at our rituals and practices and say, even though this is a most beloved tradition in our community, how might it be excluding someone or leaving someone out? And how might we adapt or adjust this ritual or practice to ensure that everybody feels included? And then finally, I do believe that accessible love is a commitment to really dismantling the structures and systems of power and privilege that exist in society at large, but also in our specific communities. So it might be rewriting policies and procedures that, again, unintentionally may be leaving someone out. The super like nitty gritty practical ways to think about how to eliminate ableism. Think about the language in liturgy. What are the metaphors that are often used? Light and dark. When light and dark are used as metaphors in the context of religious communities, it's always that the dark is the evil place and the light is the holy place. Um, I happen to have some vision, so I don't live in total darkness, but that metaphor has always struck me as problematic because for many blind people, darkness is a way of life and it's not evil or sinful or shameful. And so, what are some of the other language choices that we make consciously or unconsciously? It may be literally rearranging the worship space so that people with disabilities are not kind of shoved at the back of the worship space, but integrated more into the center of the community. It may be holding events in a different space if the church or synagogue or mosque is not super accessible so that everyone can get there. Those are, again, just a few specific actions that can be taken, and there are many, many more.
That's very helpful to start. We don't want to overwhelm people too much,
Right.
but give them a good place to start and a few steps. And I'm glad that you mentioned the language because there's a section of your book that focuses on language. So I recommend people to take a look at that part, including person first and identity first language and metaphors related to disability that we use a lot in our culture and expressions that people don't even think about. I know I didn't think about them until someone started pointing it out.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, and I think, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Rebecca. I think that's another thing, another really practical thing that we can all do around a question of language or other things too, which is to to have the courage to call people in. Loretta Ross is a scholar who's written a book. She's a race scholar, and I believe the title of the book is Calling In. But she wrote that book in response to the call out culture that we live in these days. And her proposal is that instead of thinking about calling people out, we call them in, which is an invitation to conversation and dialogue. So, um, when someone uses language, ableist language, I, I, I will admit I don't always bring it up. When I do, I try really hard to say, hey, you know, you just said blah, 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 whatever. And I'd really like to have a conversation about that. And have you ever thought about how that phrase, they have blinders on or they're blind to the truth, how that might sound to somebody like me who doesn't have 20/20 vision? And usually the response is, oh my gosh, I'd never thought about that. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to be offensive. And I say, I totally get that you did not mean to be offensive. I didn't take it that way, but I just wanted to let you know that you might think about a different way to say that. So, I mean, again, a relatively straightforward thing to do, but can have a really powerful impact on an individual as well as a community. But I interrupted you, Rebecca. I'm sorry.
No, that's actually, I was going to ask about that. What are some ways that you can bring it up in a way that doesn't make people feel defensive. And I think you just talked about that because often either people aren't aware, but then when you make them aware, they get very tentative, like now they're afraid to make a mistake. So um, that's something that could come up in dealing with any kind of ism, I think. People get, withdrawn or like hypersensitive to it. So I think that that's a great example of how you could address it in a constructive way. Um, and my other question for you again about um, people have not come up to you, but when they encounter you and um, in terms of religious aspects, like about praying for you or you need to be healed or your karma. So there's a few really interesting stories about encounters that Darla had in the airport. I think it was with your acupuncturist,
Yeah.
people from different religious traditions. Do you think it's better to say something, and how could you say something in those contexts?
Yeah. So this is a debate I have with myself all the time, particularly. So the two stories that Rebecca's referencing, very quickly, because I do want then to leave some time for questions from the rest of you. But um, the first one is I was when I travel, I get assistance because I can't read the signage in the airport to get from gate to gate, and this was quite a number of years ago, but my airport assistant was very curious about my disability, and she was lovely and, just kind of asking me all kinds of questions about how long have you been blind and how do you match your clothes in the morning and just all kinds of questions. And when she dropped me off at my gate, she said, "Oh, honey, I just feel like if you prayed hard enough, Jesus would just heal your blindness and take away all of your sins," which was not what I expected to hear from my airport assistant. Frankly, I don't really expect or want to hear that from anyone because she was, again, I believe unintentionally equating disability with sin and lack of faith. And I don't agree with that. I think that's just bad theology, quite frankly. Um, but in that moment, I have to consider, is it really the right time and place to get into this with this stranger who I may never see again? Well, I won't, almost for sure, but who may say the same thing to the next disabled passenger that she assists. And to be perfectly honest, I make different decisions about that question at different times. So I don't have a standard response ready to go. I usually assess the situation and think about, okay, A, is my flight about to leave? And therefore, I really just don't have the time. Or is this really a moment where I could engage in a really fruitful dialogue with someone about disability? And the truth is, sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't. And for those of you on the call who live with disabilities, I suspect you'll understand when I say that sometimes I have the energy to make it a teachable moment, and sometimes I don't. And I think both of those feelings and choices are just fine. So where I almost always do opt for engaging in the dialogue is when it's with my people, my friends, my colleagues, my family, my community, because those are the folks, obviously, that I'm going to be with and around, and I do generally have the time and the desire and energy to engage in those kinds of conversations. With strangers, it's sometimes hard to know how it's going to land. I don't really want to make people feel bad. I just want folks to think carefully about how what they say comes across to other people. So it's kind of a moment to moment decision for me personally. Other people make other choices. I have disabled friends who always choose to call in. I have other friends with disabilities who rarely choose to call in. So I think it is often a very individual choice. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing. As always, it can depend on the person and the situation. And some people, have to pick, as you say, pick your battles, or maybe in a religious setting, some people may feel it's more worthwhile if you're part of a community, as opposed to what you said when you encounter a stranger. But it can also be a teaching opportunity, as you said. Although I've heard many times people say, why is it my job to educate
Exactly.
everyone? So yeah, if people have questions
Yeah.
about that, maybe we can talk
Yeah.
about that more, or give them your contact. And actually, I want to get to questions from our participants. I have
Yes.
other questions for you, but that could be for another time because
Yeah.
we want to make sure everybody can get their questions answered. So,
Sure.
Sam, would you like to talk about the questions that we have?
Yes, of course. So the first question I see is from Pam Dempsey, and it says, is it possible that the authors of the books of our canon only wrote about Jesus's encounters with disabled people that contained healing experiences? In other words, is it conceivable that the ancient writers' bias was ableist as well, and therefore we don't have stories recorded where disabled people maintain the disabled identity, particularly when the value was so highly weighted towards the usefulness of human bodies for the gain of the empire?
Absolutely. I think it's an excellent point. Yes, we have snapshots in the Christian canon from Jesus's life, right? I mean, presumably about 3 years worth of his ministry, teaching, life. And even then, obviously, um, the canonical gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, don't certainly don't record everything Jesus said or did. So yes, I think yes. The folks who canonized the biblical text, so the folks who decided which stories, which events got included and which ones didn't, they made decisions, and yeah, perhaps they were the ableist people. There was ableism happening there. Um, but yes, it's very possible that there are other examples that simply have been lost to history. And I want to be really clear. There are people with disabilities who interpret the healing narratives and analyze the healing narratives very differently than I do. There are plenty of people with disabilities who find them extremely hopeful stories about healing, inclusion, and belonging in a community. So my interpretation is certainly not the only one, and there are many other possibilities. Yeah.
Thank you for that fantastic answer. Our next question is, when I tell people I'm a disability theologian, able-bodied people often respond, aren't we all a bit disabled? I find that response dismissive because it can minimize the lived reality of disability. How do you interpret remarks like this, and how should we respond to them?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I have gotten that as well. And, I think there are a number of different ways to respond to that. I believe that while I talked a lot at the beginning about how difficult it is to define disability, and if someone self-identifies as a person with a disability, I totally respect that and would never question that. But I think the questioner, I don't think there was a name, is exactly right to kind of note that there is a difference between an individual who identifies as disabled, or for whom part of their identity is that they live with a physical, mental, cognitive condition that impacts how they interact with the world. So there's a difference between that and sort of a more generic definition of, aren't we all disabled in some way? Well, maybe, but what we're talking about here is is a particular way of interacting with the world that is very embodied, and that changes how our bodies and minds interact because of the ways in which the world is constructed. So I feel like that was a little convoluted, but what I mean here is, the world, the built environment around us is almost always constructed in a way that privileges bodies that can see, hear, move, and think super quickly and without much effort. And that is what I am referring to as people with disabilities. Someone might break their leg and use crutches for a month or 6 weeks. And that is an experience of limitation and maybe temporary disability, but that is not a person who lives with a disability day in and day out. So, again, in those moments, I usually say, yeah, no, not everyone is disabled in the way that I mean. Everybody lives with limitations. we certainly, I think, would all agree, we all experience some form of limitation. And many of us, even if we're not technically, diagnosed with a disability, might even live with some forms of physical limitations. But I think there's a real difference between that and inhabiting a body that is never going to be able to function in the way that the fast-paced built environment is designed for bodies to function.
Thank you. The next question we have is from Kimberly, and it says, "It seems most of us don't know what we don't know. For example, I have been told not to use the words disabled and disability, but during this forum it seems acceptable. Where do we start with reframing our understanding? And how do we move forward with humility, compassion, and understanding from all perspectives?"
So I'm going to say, Kimberly, your question tells me that you are a person who lives humbly and compassionately, just because you're already thinking about these issues and asking all the right questions. So language, yes, is tricky. Um, Again, different people with and without disabilities have different perspectives on your great question about using disability and disabled. I do write about this in the book, and I'm really clear that I personally prefer to use the most descriptive, straightforward language that is available. So for me to say that I have a disability or I am a disabled person, both of those statements are very descriptive and honest. And I personally don't like euphemisms or sort of language that tries to make it sound different than it is. I give the example in the book of if you were asked to describe someone across the room, just, oh, what does that person standing in the corner look like? If I asked you to describe someone to me, because I can't see what they look like, you might say, oh, they have brown hair, they're tall, wearing a blue shirt, gray pants, whatever. Those are all really descriptive terms. And that's what I recommend in terms of people with disabilities. I am a blind woman who usually moves through the world with a crazy handsome guide dog. And when I am not with a crazy handsome guide dog, I'm with a crazy handsome husband. And those are, okay, I'm biased, but those are descriptive terms that explain who I am, how I look, how I move through the world. But at the end of the day, I think the best thing to do is to ask people what they prefer. So I prefer disability, disabled. I mean, those are words I prefer. Someone else might prefer something different. What I appreciate, what is the most heartwarming to me, is when someone just says, hey, I'm a little bit uncomfortable. I don't know what language to use. What would you suggest? What do you prefer? Then we can have a conversation about it. And usually the awkwardness disappears. It can feel hard to ask that question. I always appreciate it and encourage others to give it a try.
And then I think this is our last question I see, but it is from Jalissa and it says, I haven't read your newest book, but I appreciate your edited work on disability in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, especially your chapter on John. As a part of my research is on Johannine theology and neurodivergence. Pondering metaphors, it occurred to me that language is almost inherently ableist, just by its very nature. But language pushes our mind as we tackle very human problems, and it is in this tension that language sits. How do we acknowledge the inherent nature of ableism while using it as a tool to further understanding?
Wow, great question, Jalissa. Um, so I think you nailed it, right? Um, Language is inherently problematic. Um, we use ableist, sexist, racist, classist, the list goes on and on, language and metaphors all the time by nature of language and the culture in which we live. I I probably have used problematic language in the past hour and maybe wasn't even aware of it. And so, to a certain extent, again, I think the best we can do is to acknowledge when we do notice it, to own it, apologize if that's appropriate and necessary in that moment, and to commit to trying to do the best that we possibly can, because probably we're gonna mess up at some point. And, we were talking earlier, when I talk to friends, and again, almost not quite every day, maybe, but almost every day, I am in a conversation with someone and they say, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe I just said that," some ableist something or other. And they say, "I'm really sorry." And I often say, "Thank you for noticing." For me, that alone is a great thing if you are thinking about it and you notice. And I do it all the time too. I mean, it takes a very conscious commitment to changing the language we use, and we're probably just not always going to get it right. And that is the tension, as Jalissa put it. But to be able to acknowledge and notice when it happens, and again, to kind of bring it back around to our religious communities, to be able to struggle together openly and honestly about when we do it and how we might do it better and differently is, I think, the best we can do. And then call each other in when we slip up, which we will, with love and kindness and humility and compassion. And, if if we all did that in our respective religious communities, we'd start to really make a difference, I think. So I think we're out of time. Is that right?
We are, and Darla, we want to thank you for talking with us today, and certainly want to continue discussions with you and some of the issues that you've raised, and also we put a link in the chat where you can purchase the book from
Oh,
Rutgers
and
Press.
here, shameless self-promotion.
Oh, no, no. And
Here's the book.
to have a little bit of fun today, we're going to ask Darla to choose a number between 3 and 25, and that person will receive a free book, whichever that order that is in the participants list. So
I have an 18-year-old son, so I'm going to choose 18. How's that?
that's great. Let's see, 1, 2, 3.
I want to just say thank you to everybody who showed up today. I'm honored that you all took time out of your very busy schedules. And thanks again to Tom and Rebecca. And another note of shameless self-promotion. I am happy and available to speak with other groups and communities. I do workshops with religious communities. So I don't know, Tom or Rebecca, if you might be able to pop my contact info into the chat. I have a web page, just darlaschumm.com, where you can find more information and a contact link. So I love having these conversations and I love to keep doing it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Darla. And so we shared your website and in the chat, and Maria Calado Cuniff will get the free book, and so we will
Great.
send you her address, Darla.
Great. And I will
And
get that out in the mail ASAP.
okay, and the question was, there is an audio book, is that correct?
There is an audiobook. Yep. I insisted.
Okay, great, great. Okay, well, thank you for joining us today. And this was very popular, and I can see why now. So we hope to continue conversations. Darla will be plenary at the Institute on Theology and Disability June 15th through 17th at St. Thomas in Minneapolis. So we can connect with her in person there
Yeah.
if you
Looking
like.
forward to it.
And so next week we have Mark Bradford, who's the editor of Indispensable. He is it's how to welcome people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the Catholic Church. He's written from a Catholic perspective. However, you don't have to be Catholic to attend this. Many of the ways that we welcome people with disabilities into the church or a faith community are the same across religions, faiths. And so also he will be attending with Charlene Kotroff, who's the executive director of the National Catholic Partnership on Disability. Who they've done some extensive work there in working towards the inclusion of people with disabilities in the Catholic Church. So I hope you'll join us and join us next week. And again, if you want to continue to talk with Darla and carry on some conversations, it's darlaschumm.com, and so you can reach her there. So until then, may God bless all of you and the work you're doing, and may He be with you in all of your efforts. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.